from people said to have turned feral after a frontier disaster and vanished into the woods, to a wild human caught keeping bones in his den, to backcountry hikers who hear a person's whistle answered from the brush. Here are 8 places in America where feral people are still being reported. Number 8. Spring Creek, Missouri. The Blue Man. Start where Saul Collins started, Douglas County, Missouri. Wild, broken country along the Big North Fork, Indian Creek and Spring Creek. The thing he saw on that ridge got a name. They called it the Blue Man of Spring Creek. It is one of the most stubbornly documented wild man legends in the country. This is not a story that lived only around campfires. It lived in the newspapers. For decades, the Springfield Leader carried it. So did the Moberly Weekly Monitor. So did papers as far away as St. Joseph. They tracked the Blue Man through the 1860s, the 1870s, all the way into the 1920s. In 1924, the Springfield Leader put it about as flatly as a paper can. It called the Blue Man a genuine Ozark legend, and it said that if the testimony of scores of men over all those years was to be believed, the legend was absolutely true. Here is what the documented record actually holds. For decades, farms scattered through those hills lost livestock, calves, sheep, hogs, gone, and the people who went looking sometimes found what was left: discarded hides, clean-picked bones, tucked into remote crannies among the rocks. In 1911, the story goes, a posse tracked the creature to a den. They found it lined with sheep pelts, hog hides, dog skins, bones, and feathers. That part is the spine of it. Something was killing stock and dragging it off to eat. That happened. Then there is the layer the old-timers tell. This is where it gets under your skin. There was a theory in Douglas County about where the Blue Man came from. They said that generations earlier, before the Revolution, a fur trader came through the Ozarks with a woman. He abandoned her in the wilderness. She lost her reason, and she lived for years as a wild thing in the hills. From her came a line of people who never mingled with anyone, people who hid away in the most inaccessible places. By one account printed in 1925, the original wild man had died, but his children, it was said, still lived in a wild state on the banks of Spring Creek, going naked, surviving on raw game. That is the thing this story keeps circling back to. Not a monster, a bloodline. People who went into the hills and did not come back to being people. And the men of those hills were hard men. Men who could track and kill anything that walked. Yet they said plainly that not one of them wanted to meet the Blue Man alone. People feared the Blue Man. They feared it the way you fear something you can't explain. But 2,000 miles of frontier to the south, an entire region feared something else. Something it had been seeing since before the Pacific Northwest ever had a word for it. Number 7. The Arkansas Bottoms, the Wild Man of the Woods. Most people think the giant hair-covered man starts out west, in the Redwoods, sometime in the 20th century. It does not. It starts in Arkansas, and it starts early. As far back as 1834, settlers pushed into the swamps and bottoms of eastern Arkansas, and they began reporting a creature. They called it, simply, the Wild Man of the Woods. By 1851, it was in the papers back east. The Vermont Watchman ran an account of 2 hunters in Greene County. They watched a gigantic, hair-covered figure chasing a herd of cattle. When it saw them, it stopped. It stared for a long moment. Then it bounded into the trees, leaping, they swore, 12 to 14 feet at a stride. By then, it had already been reported across St. Francis, Greene, and Poinsett counties for nearly 20 years. And here is the detail that makes this one land. The people who lived there had an explanation, and it was not a monster. Many of them believed the wild man was a human being, a survivor of the Great New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812, someone who fled into the woods during that catastrophe and never came back to civilization. A person who had gone feral. That was the local theory, told plainly by the people closest to it. The reports were not always gentle. One account spread across the country's papers in 1856. It told of a party of men who went after the creature on horseback. One of them got ahead of the others. He decided to take it alone. By the period telling, that was a grave mistake. The wild man rushed him, dragged him from his saddle, mauled him badly before the others could reach him. Whatever the truth of that old report, it tells you how these people understood the thing in their woods, not as a curiosity, as something dangerous. In Arkansas, they only ever chased it. It stayed ahead of every posse and every pack of dogs. It vanished back into the cane and the cypress. But down in the swamps of the Florida Panhandle, 100 armed men did something the Arkansans never managed. They caught one. Number 6. Ocheesee Pond, Florida. The thing they caught. Ocheesee Pond sits in the southeast corner of Jackson County, Florida. 3 miles of clear, shallow water choked with cypress. Beautiful, and when the light goes, deeply foreboding. The local native people had warned the earlier settlers about it. A man-like creature, covered in hair, taller than a man. It roamed the remote swamps, and it was best left alone. In 1883, the people living around the pond started seeing it. It moved between the little Cypress Islands by swimming, wading through the dark water from one stand of trees to the next. At night, its cries carried across the farms along the shore. As the sightings piled up, so did the fear. Finally, the families around Ocheesee decided they'd had enough. They organized. Men gathered with guns and boats and horses. They worked out a plan to close in on the creature's last known spot from several directions at once. And on August 18th, 1884, the news went out from Columbus, Georgia. They had taken him, a wild man, captured in Ocheesee's swamp and carried to Tallahassee, naked, emaciated, covered head to foot in a phenomenal growth of hair. And here is the part that has never been resolved. He could give no account of himself at all. They checked whether he had escaped a Florida asylum. He had not. Every inquiry to identify him came back empty. The best anyone could guess was this. He'd broken out of some asylum in another state. Then he disappeared into the swamp to live on berries and whatever he could catch. So they had him, a real, living, feral man, sitting in custody in Tallahassee, and not one person in the state could say who he was. Then the newspapers went silent. The same papers that were so happy to report the capture said nothing about what happened next. He simply drops out of the record, a man with no name and no past, caught in a swamp, and then nothing. He is out there in the history of Florida as a question mark and nothing more. Florida's wild man never said a word anyone could understand, but in the mountains of East Tennessee, 4 hunters cornered one that fought. It threw grown men off it like they were children. Number 5. Chilhowee, Tennessee. The Wild Man of the Mountain. East Tennessee, 1896. The magazine Forest and Stream printed a strange account. This was a respectable sporting publication, not a tabloid. It told of 4 hunters who came across a naked man deep in the forest near Chilhowee. This was no lost hiker. They described talon-like fingernails and toenails, a beard and hair grown all the way to his waist, a body that had clearly been living wild for a very long time. They decided to take him. The plan was to haul him down to Cleveland, Tennessee. The four of them moved in to seize him, and the wild man, by their account, simply overpowered all four. He threw them off through sheer brute strength, and he ran. Sit with that detail. 4 grown hunting men could not hold one. It took a full posse going back in after him to finally run him down and take him. And what they did with him then tells you exactly how the era understood these men. They sent him to the insane asylum, because that is the quiet truth under the Tennessee wildman. It runs under a lot of these stories. This region, McNairy County, the deep Appalachian hollows of the East, had reported wild men since the early 1800s. And again, when one was actually caught, what they found was a person. A human being who had walked away from the world or been driven out of it. Someone who went feral in the timber until he was barely recognizable as one of us anymore. Tennessee's wild man got a destination at least. They knew where he ended up. But far to the north, in the deep woods of Maine, 3 men ran into something that did not get caught, and it left one of them dead behind it. Number 4. North of Moosehead Lake, Maine, the one that killed. October of 1886. The same month the Statue of Liberty was dedicated in New York Harbor. Newspapers across New England carried a darker story out of the Maine North Woods. A frightened man had come down out of the wilderness with a tail, and by the paper's own account, the town believed it completely. 3 men had been camping roughly 100 miles north of Moosehead Lake. Even now, that is about as deep into nothing as the lower 48 gets. 2 of them had been away from the camp for about a week. When they came back, they found the 3rd man dead. Not lost, dead in the camp. And something had done it. They did what people in these stories always do. They went for help. They came back with a posse, a dozen or more men, and they searched the woods for whatever had killed their friend. What the survivor described was a wild man, a towering, hair-covered figure, the kind of thing we'd file under Bigfoot today. But the people of 1886 spoke about it as a murderer that needed catching. They never caught it. What makes Maine sit differently is how far back the reports run, and across how many different peoples. Long before any of this, the native peoples around Mount Katahdin spoke of a figure they called Pamula, a dangerous spirit of that mountain. The settlers' own sightings in Maine trace back to at least the 1850s. Different cultures, different centuries, the same dark shape in the same deep woods. That is the part that should bother you. Not that one man told one story, but that so many people who never met, who never compared notes, kept describing the same thing in the same trees. Maine's wild man stayed in the far country, where you'd almost expect it. But the next one walked right up on a town selectman. He was picking blackberries on a country road, and then it refused to die for 80 years. Number 3. Winsted, Connecticut, the one that should not exist. This one belongs here for a reason that might surprise you. We can almost prove it was invented, and it terrified people anyway. And then it came back. August 1895. A selectman named Riley Smith was walking a wooded road outside Winsted, Connecticut. He had his bulldog with him. He stopped to pick a few blackberries. The dog went to investigate some bushes. It came back whimpering, cowering between Smith's legs. And then it happened. By the account that ran in the Winsted papers, a tall, naked man covered in long black hair exploded out of the brush, leaping into the air, shrieking. He bolted into the woods, his black hair streaming behind him. Smith was known as a level-headed man, not a teller of tall tales. And that was the whole point. When a man like that says he saw it, people listen. Over the following weeks, more witnesses came forward with matching descriptions. The town went into something close to hysteria. People were afraid to leave their homes. Eventually, around 100 armed men assembled. They marched into the hills to hunt the thing down. They split into groups. They spread across the spots where it had been seen. And as the sun went down, some of them opened fire on what they were sure was the wild man. It turned out to be a stray mule. The mule did not survive the misunderstanding. Now, here is the honest part. The Winsted wild man is widely tied to a local newspaper man named Louis Stone. He earned the nickname the Winsted Liar. He built a career on invented stories, talking dogs, uphill rivers, patriotic hens. There's good reason to think the wild man was, at least in part, exactly that kind of fabrication. Dreamed up to sell papers and put the town on the map. Some researchers argue the details aren't so simple, but you should know going in. This is the one entry on this list where the smart money says someone made it up. So why does it still belong here? Because it did not matter that it was probably a lie. Almost 80 years later, in July of 1972, two young men reported a tall, hair-covered figure near Crystal Lake. 2 years after that, in 1974, two couples parked near Rugbrook Reservoir. They told police they fled in terror, a 6-foot, 300-pound creature covered in dark hair standing in the moonlight. That is the genuinely unsettling thing about a feral man's story. You can trace it back to one man's typewriter, and it still claws its way back out of those woods a lifetime later, wearing somebody else's fear. Name the woods, and the woods seem to answer. Winstead's was likely a hoax that bred real terror. But for every story we can trace to a single liar, there are dozens nobody ever explained at all. And they all happened in the same strange window of years. Number 2. The frontier states, the ones they hunted down. In the decades right after the Civil War, something happened across the American backcountry. Historians have actually studied it, a wave of wild man sightings, breaking out in state after state, all describing roughly the same figure. A naked or half-clad man, hair grown long and matted, living in the timber, fast, strong, and wordless. And the response was almost always the same. Hunt him, catch him, then put him on display, or put him away. In Idaho in 1883, a group of emigrants passing through killed the so-called wild man of Kama's with an axe. In Vermont, a wild man haunting Shatsack Mountain was run down. He turned out to be a Prussian immigrant. He'd been living for 5 months on wild berries, apples, and woodchucks. In northeastern Ohio, a ragged, hairy man drifted into town. He was identified as one John Kinney, described as once an intelligent and educated man, now found violently insane. In Wisconsin, in 1899, a constable led a posse of 50 men through the forest near Chippewa Falls. They finally found their wild man sitting in the fork of a tree, glaring, wrapped in nothing but a filthy sack. An aged man who could no longer speak at all, if he ever could, after his long solitude in the woods. And then there is Kansas. That is the one that stays with me. In 1886, out in the Flint Hills, the reports were of a wild man wearing handcuffs, almost certainly an escaped convict who had gone to ground in the wilderness. By the account that ran, he had killed people, and when they finally hunted him down and went into his lair, they found the skeletons of his victims. Maybe every detail is true. Maybe some of it grew in the retelling, but hold onto the shape of it. A man, a real man, who fled into the country and came back out as something that kept bones. Because that is the uncomfortable thread running through all of these. Strip away the tusks and the 10-foot heights, that the newspapers love to add. What you keep finding underneath is people. Deserters who fled the war and never came back. Immigrants with no language to explain themselves. The mentally ill turned out of a society that had no place for them. Surviving in the timber until they stopped looking human to the people who found them. The era called them monsters. That was easier than what they actually were. Every one of those stories had an ending, a capture, a grave, a name, even if it came too late, which is exactly what makes the last place on this list different, because there, the reports are not 100 years old. People are still calling them in, and nobody can give you a name at all. Number 1. The backcountry today, the ones still out there. Every year in the United States, something like 2,000 people are reported missing in our wild places. The national parks, the national forests, the vast stretches of public land. The overwhelming majority are found within days. Lost, hurt, caught by weather, then recovered. But not all of them. Some are simply never seen again. And in recent years, a theory has spread. Across TikTok, across Reddit, across 1,000 late-night videos. The claim is that some of those disappearances are not accidents, that there are feral people out there in the deep country, and that they are the reason some hikers walk in and never walk out. You should hear this part plainly. Honest storytelling demands it. That claim has not been proven. There is no substantiated evidence that tribes of feral humans are taking people in the national parks. Most of what circulates is exactly the kind of detail adding that turned a likely Connecticut hoax into an 80-year legend. The people who study this push back hard, and they're right to. A whole hidden tribe could not stay undetected in an American forest for long. The country is too crossed with hunters and hikers and satellites for that. But here is the part that should sit with you. They will also tell you something else. A single person, a loner, a hermit, could absolutely live for months or even years in the remote backcountry without anyone knowing. That has always been true. It was true of the man at Ocheesy Pond. It was true of John Kinney in Ohio. It is true right now tonight, in country you could not walk out of before dark. So a hiker comes off a trail shaken. They say they were followed by something that moved on two legs and kept to the trees. They say they heard their own whistle answered back from the brush. And the honest answer is that we don't know. It is almost certainly the mind doing what minds do in big, empty country. Almost certainly. But the reports keep coming in, the same way they came in to a constable in Wisconsin in 1899, the same way they came into the papers in Arkansas in 1851. That is why the title of this is in the present tense. Not because we can prove anyone is out there, because people have never in 200 years stopped saying that someone is. The tracks in the snow. Go back to the beginning, back to Saul Collins on that ridge above Spring Creek in the winter of 1865. He was following tracks that were too long and too broad, the marks of claws dragged into the snow between them. He had hunted everything in those hills, and when he came over the rise, he saw the thing standing there, throwing boulders down at him. An object, as the old account put it, unmistakably human, though strongly resembling a vicious animal. He turned and he ran. The fearless man ran, and his neighbors went on seeing the blue man for 60 more years. That is the shape every story on this list shares. It is there in the Florida swamp and the Maine deep woods, in the Tennessee mountains and the Kansas hills and the Connecticut Blackberry Road. The reports go quiet. A decade passes, a generation, a lifetime. And then someone comes out of the trees with the same look on their face, telling the same story people were telling before they were born. Maybe the thing in the woods was a monster. Maybe an escaped convict keeping bones. Maybe a lost soul who forgot how to be a person. Maybe a country newspaperman's lie that grew legs. Either way, the woods keep handing the story back. Of everything here, the one that gets me is Kansas. The handcuffs. A man who ran from us and came back out as something that frightened armed men. Because that is the real fear under all of it, isn't it? Not that there are monsters in the woods, but that the woods can take a person and make one. The grounded truth is the one we started with. Around 2,000 people vanish into America's wild places every year. And the country is full of remote ground where a single soul could disappear and live on, unseen. Most of these stories have an ordinary explanation. Most. So I'll leave you with the 2 questions I can't shake. Of these 8, which one unsettled you the most? And, be honest, which one did we miss in the woods near you? Because somebody watching this lives near a story I haven't found yet. Put it in the comments. Tell me the name of the place. And tell me what they say walks there. The list is never really finished. It just goes quiet for a while.